please feel free to just say hello in the chat and where you're joining us from tonight. Great to have you here. This is great. Yeah, so we've got quite a few people joining us already, and we are going to maybe just take another half a minute or so to let some more people join, and then we'll get underway. So thanks very much to those of you who are joining us tonight. It's going to be a very interesting evening, I think, and a lot of really good discussions. So we'll get started in just about a minute or so. Okay, 7:02. So I think we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining this session where we're going to learn more about London's urban growth, what's happening to farmland in this area and across Ontario, and the impact of both of those on local food security. So my name is Lella Bloomer. I'm a member of the Middlesex-London Food Policy Council, and we're co-hosting this event along with the London Environmental Network. So I just want to take a minute to introduce a couple of people. Diane Mccomb is also from the Middlesex-London Food Policy Council, and she'll be co-hosting this session tonight. And Deepika Giri is from the London Environmental Network. She has been providing some amazing creative and technical support for us. So thank you so much to Deepika and to Leah from LEN. And thanks to all of you for being here. It's really great to see the turnout tonight. A couple of the housekeeping items that we're getting used to with these online meetings. The meeting is being recorded. So if you want to turn your video off, if you prefer not to be seen in the recording, that's fine. But if you're okay with that, then we really like to see your faces. So that's totally up to you. You have been muted when you entered into the meeting, and you will continue to stay muted. And I just ask that you do that during the presentations, so that we can really pay attention to what the speakers are saying. But if you do have questions, if they come to you as you're listening to the presenters, please feel free to enter those in the chat. And then Diane and I will be gathering those, and we'll be bringing those forward to the Q&A session that's going to be at the end of the presentations tonight. And also, if you happen to be having any technical issues, then please use the chat box and let Deepika know, and we'll see if we can troubleshoot that as we go along. So once again, welcome everyone. We do have a good turnout here. So we're going to get underway. And if people join us later, then we'll just fill them in as we go along. So I'd like to begin tonight by acknowledging that we're undertaking this discussion in a city and in a region that's incredibly rich in natural resources and that has sustained life for many thousands of years. But the impact of settlers and colonialism has been damaging to the balance that existed and was understood and upheld by Indigenous peoples here, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and then the Napawick. And it's still understood and upheld by the 3 local First Nations of this area. So the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nation. Although mutual respect and care for the land was part of treaties, including the dish with one spoon, those of us who are settlers here have unfulfilled obligations under those treaties, and that continues to cause destruction, personally and environmentally. So as we discuss tonight, the relationship that we have with the land and with the environment that we live in and that sustains us, I ask that we do so humbly and with open minds. Thank you. So we have two presenters who will be enlightening us today. First, I'm very pleased to introduce Crispin Colvin. Crispin is a cash crop, soybeans, corn, and wheat farmer who lives in Middlesex County. He's been a member of the Ontario Federation of Agriculture's Board of Directors since 2016, and he currently represents the counties of Lambton and Middlesex. So Crispin presented recently to the Middlesex-London Food Policy Council on the Ontario Federation of Agriculture's Homegrown Campaign, which is to raise awareness about the rapid loss of farmland to urban development across Ontario. And I am really happy to welcome him here tonight. Crispin, over to you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Just wait for my slides to get put up, and I'll be saying next all the time, so that'll be part of my presentation. So if we can just get the first slide up. I also represent Lambton Middlesex, and I'm also on the executive of the Ontario Federation of Agriculture as well. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So just to give a bit of background, you skipped one. Oh no, you didn't, my mistake. My apologies. We represent 38,000 farm families. The OFA is actually the largest farm organization in Ontario, and I believe it may also be the largest in Canada. The UPA in Quebec might tip us, but I'm not sure. But one of our objectives is that we work to ensure that the agri-food sector is included and consulted in any new legislation that impacts the sustainability of our farm businesses. And there's lots of legislation that comes down the pipe that we have comments on, and we have a tremendous research staff that are able to help us with that. Next slide, please. So the Homegrown Campaign came about, officially launched on May the 4th. And the purpose, as you can see there, is to increase awareness, educate the public, and enhance consumer knowledge on the threat and negative impacts urban development poses to our agri-food system. We focus on some key messages around preserving and protecting farmland and food production. There's also a link if you wish to support the Homegrown campaign at the change.org. There you can see it, the online petition. Next slide, please. Ontario's agricultural lands are a finite and shrinking resource. Ontario simply cannot continue to lose the agricultural land that we have while maintaining our ability to produce food. The 2016 Census of Agriculture showed that Ontario farms comprised 12.3 million acres, which is actually less than 5% of Ontario's land area. And when we compare the 2011 and the 2016 census, Ontario lost over 63,000 acres of farmland per year. That's the equivalent of 175 acres per day that we lose of agricultural land. And it's not just any land that we're losing. Ontario is losing some of its most productive agricultural land, the class 1, 2, and 3 land that Southern Ontario sits on. In fact, Ernie Hardeman, the former Minister of Agriculture, used to say quite regularly that the best farmland in Ontario was underneath Toronto. Next slide, please. So agriculture, we produce more than 200 commodities. That's more than any other province in the country. And we're able to produce over 200 commodities because we have the best land in the country and we have an equally good climate, although I know that there are many of you who would say winter leaves a lot to be desired. But when you take into account the food and fiber that we produce, we're supplying 860,000 jobs, and we are supplying $47 billion in GDP to the economy. Next slide, please. So the local planning process is very important to us. Local planning provides a framework for a balanced consideration of land use needs for agriculture and for development. But ministers' zoning orders The recent issuance of a number of them short circuits that long established planning principles and the policies, and it's basically very short-sighted. Next slide, please. OFA believes that the best use for our land, our arable land, is agriculture. It's the highest use, it's the best use. Land capable of supporting agricultural activities is a finite and strategic and non-renewable resource that we should be preserving because it provides Canada and Ontario with safe, affordable, sustainable food. Only 14% of the countries in the world are self-sufficient and have excess crop production. In Europe, only France is considered self-sufficient. And there are only 8 major countries in the world who are self-sufficient, and Canada is one of them in food production. Next slide. So simply put, we cannot continue to lose agricultural lands at a rate of 175 acres a day. The OFA has a deep-seated concern with the recent proliferation of minister zoning orders issued for municipalities, especially ones that have a robust planning system. MZOs actually eliminate the conversation around whether a proposed growth can be accommodated through intensification or redevelopment or in designated growth areas, particularly now that the requirement for compliance with the provincial policy statement is removed under an MZO. Use of MZOs do not provide an adequate framework for understanding the impact of taking land out of production. And MZOs have been used at least 6 or 7 times to rezone farmland for urban use. Currently, there are development pressures in York in the Greenbelt. Developers want to use the Greenbelt for parks and recreation land, taking it out of agricultural production, which allows them to put up more houses and more development. This would be death of the Greenbelt by 1,000 cuts. Additionally, the city of Woodstock is negotiating with Esora Tavistock to try and remove 2,300 acres, in excess of 2,300 acres of prime agricultural land in Oxford County to use for development for the city of Woodstock. Next slide, please. Our first communication on the issue as an organization was sent to the minister in August of 2020. And in that communication, we commented that this undermines Ontario's long-established planning system. MZOs undermine it wholly. We asked the minister for support in deferring the use of MZOs in areas that had a robust planning process. And many of the parts of the province have that robust planning process. Next slide, please. We've also asked for agricultural impact assessments. MZOs are not evaluated on the basis of an agricultural impact assessment. The OFA has called for the widespread introduction and mandatory use of agricultural impact assessments throughout the province, not just Greenbelt and Greater Golden Horseshoe, where they are currently mandated. All lands developed in rural Ontario on farmland should be subject to an agricultural impact assessment. We need to know what we are implicating, what will be lost, and the impacts of the decision on agricultural land. We need to know what food source might be lost. And without an agricultural impact assessment, we won't have that answer. Next slide, please. So under the recent Planning Act, we've recommended to the minister the strengthening of the provincial policy statement to require fixed urban settlement boundaries and policies requiring mandatory intensification within existing built-up urban areas, as well as mandatory greenfield density requirements. The region of Waterloo is one of the probably better examples of intensification and staying within their boundaries. Next slide, please. With all of these changes to the process occurring alongside the issuance of new minister's zoning orders, we're concerned that the result could be the continued loss of more of our diminishing supply of arable land. And it comes without any thought or a balanced approach. And that is a fearsome thought. Next slide, please. So the OFA believes that providing advanced public notice of MZOs and any amendment to them is important. Currently, any MZO that is issued, there is no appeal, there is no public meeting, there is no ability for comment. It is simply made to happen. Next slide, please. Agricultural lands provide an awful lot of benefit. And we don't always think about the benefit that it provides. Because once a farm is turned into a shopping center or a warehouse or a subdivision, it won't produce food ever again. So aside from local food production, farmland provides an expansive list of environmental benefits to all Ontarians. Next slide, please. So once it's taken out of production, you lose many of the ecological benefits that farmland provides. Things like wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration, climate change mitigation, and groundwater recharge. None of that is going to happen once that land is taken out of production and turned into development. Next slide. So access to local food. The COVID-19 pandemic has amplified the demand for local food production. Consumers are increasingly looking for locally grown food, meats, and dairy products. And for the first time in generations, we saw some empty store shelves. Fortunately, we have a strong supply chain and we weathered the storm. 70% of the food that is grown, that we consume in Canada, 70% of the food we consume is grown and produced in Canada. 50% of what we produce in the nation, we actually export. Next slide, please. The bottom line is we're down to less than 5% of Ontario's land base that can be suitable for food, and all the jobs, the economic benefit, the environmental impact, and the food security that that land provides. We saw how vaccine nationalism, what happened in Europe when vaccines for COVID were developed, and Europe threatened to keep them all in Europe until such time as their population was vaccinated. Nations got upset. It wasn't right. But imagine the consequences of food nationalism. If we cannot feed our own population, what would the consequences be? This is why we need intensification of and to preserve our farmland so that we can continue to produce food for Ontarians and Canadians, and sustainable agriculture is part of that solution. That's my presentation. Thank you. And I'm more than happy to answer questions if there are any.
Thanks so much, Crispin. There's a lot packed into that presentation. So thank you very much for everything you're bringing forward. And I'll just remind people that if you do have questions, if anything came up while you were listening to Crispin's presentation, please just put them in the chat, and we will bring them forward at the Q&A after we've heard from our next presenters. So again, thanks very much, Crispin. A couple of things there that were new for me, even though I've heard you speak before, especially that 70% of what we consume in Canada is grown here, is what I think I heard you say. And that was a bit of a surprise to me. So looking forward to exploring that a little bit further in the Q&A. Thanks very much. So moving on to our second presenter, Travis Macbeth is a senior planner in the City of London's Planning and Development Department. His experience includes a range of land use planning and growth management projects, such as the London Plan and Industrial Lands Urban Growth Boundary Review, affordable housing initiatives, and regeneration of surplus government sites. Travis is a registered professional planner, and he holds master's degrees in planning and in regional studies. We're really glad to have him with us here tonight shed some light on the city side of this. What exactly is our urban growth boundary? How does that get set? And what's the process behind all of that? So Travis, welcome. Thanks very much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Can you hear me all right? Okay, great. I'll just share my screen here. All right, so we'll go to the, so you might be wondering why I would start a discussion on the protection of agricultural lands with an image of downtown London. And this is because, in fact, the intensification and other urban uses that are going on fit hand in glove with protection of agricultural lands and those goals. In the foreground there is actually the old Victoria Hospital lands, which is now being redeveloped as well. So in discussing this with Leila, some of the things that we thought might be interesting would be the urban growth boundary in London and what is that? You know, different expansions of the boundary, London plan policies as they relate to growth and agricultural protection, and then what is the comprehensive review that's involved in evaluating your boundary and potentially adjusting it or expanding it. So not to get overly dry and bureaucratic, but again, the starting point is the provincial policy statement. And the term that the city uses is urban growth boundary. The term in provincial documents is settlement area boundary, but it means the same thing. So it's the provincial policy statements are, notwithstanding the MZO issue, they are something that all decisions of municipal council are required to be consistent with. It's policies that direct growth and development to those settlement areas to support the viability of rural areas and to protect natural heritage features, natural hazards, and natural resource lands. And in the PPS, it identifies that the settlement area boundary, it distinguishes the role between those urban and rural lands. So a municipality can either identify a settlement area if they don't have one or a new one, or they can expand an existing one at the time of a comprehensive review. So the comprehensive review is the citywide review of your population and your projected population, and then your land needs, your vacant land and your designated land, and whether or not you have sufficient land to accommodate your growth. And that's done as part of every official plan review that happens in a municipality. It's a public process, so there's public meetings and advertising, and we try and get the public involved. The settlement area boundary, it again defines that amount of land, and it's for residential as well as employment lands and commercial lands and the non-residential uses. And the PPS says that it can be up to 25 years. The London plan has identified a up to 20-year boundary in its policies. Rural London here, the sort of green outside the boundary, the provincial policy statement identifies, this is the area that is prime agricultural land, natural heritage features, rural settlements. So that's kind of the small hamlets, but areas that are not expected to have significant growth. And then the PPS also defines permitted uses that are allowed within these rural areas. So that's management of resources, agriculture and value added associated on farm diversification and agritourism. So then the urban land uses, the urban growth boundary there, the lands inside that is where there's intended to be the concentration and mix of all those more intensive urban types of uses that we would expect. Those are also the lands that are designated in your official plan for the life of the plan. So one thing you might notice is that there's certain areas that you see farmland, but if it's inside this boundary, at some point a council made a decision that it is planned for to accommodate that growth as part of one of those reviews. So it may be farmed right now, but in the long term, it is not intended for farming. It is intended long-term for residential or other types of uses. But the PPS also identifies that sufficient land has to be made available through intensification and redevelopment and infill and all the sorts of things you might get applications sent around to you if there's something happening in your neighborhood. And that inside this urban growth boundary, it is the area for the focus for growth and development. So just trying to minimize there. Okay, sorry, my window of people was getting in the way of my text here. So when can it be expanded? So a justification for an expansion, again, is at the end of that comprehensive review. So if it's found that there isn't sufficient room for growth through intensification and redevelopment during that 20-year period, or if there are things such as availability of infrastructure, those kinds of issues, then an expansion could be considered as part of that update of your official plan. In those cases, there still has to be evaluation of alternative directions for growth, depending on which way you would be going and what kind of prime agricultural land that would be impacting, if there's some that are lesser soils than others. There's also, you have to comply with the minimum distance separation, which is separation between livestock facilities and other types of uses. And then mitigation of impacts on those existing agricultural operations that are adjacent. So recently the province also added into the PPS this adjustments. So rather than an expansion of that urban boundary, an adjustment where there's no net increase, but so like a swapping, say someone owns property on both sides of a street and one side in and one side's out, that concept of swapping but no actual increase. It can be used for meeting intensification targets that municipalities have established, but it also still has to address those issues around alternatives for growth and prime agricultural lands and sufficient infrastructure capacity. So in part, expanding the UGB is also around the extension of roads and pipelines and managing the public costs associated with that. Where's my next slide? There we are. So London's urban growth boundary, as you saw on those other slides, it was first established in 1996. It's fully enforced in the London Plan, which is the new official plan for the city. It is about 24,000 hectares in size, but over 40% of London is in rural lands and is located outside of that boundary. So London has a very large rural component to it, despite the thinking, and I think a lot of the thinking of referring to the city is the urban part of the city rather than municipality. How has it been amended over time? Since 2004, it's been amended a little. It has been added to a little bit less than 2%. And again, you'll see when it was first introduced, the OMB expanded it quite a bit from what was originally proposed in 1999 there. And then during subsequent reviews of the official plan, either certain lands were added or there was no justification depending. The most recent was employment lands along the Veterans Memorial Parkway in the east there. So again, that first slide showed downtown London. So hand in glove with any goals of environmental protection or agricultural protection are what are the goals for the type of urban development you're going to see on the other side of that line. So that list there of urban place types, and that's the term for the land use designations in the London Plan, that's kind of the hierarchy there of the most intensive and highest heights. Downtown transit villages at the end of a planned rapid transit network, as well as some other corridors and redevelopment of shopping areas. So growth in the cities in the London Plan is an emphasis on inward and upward growth. And there are key policy directions to create a mixed use and compact city, as well as managing that outward growth through the use of the urban growth boundary and by supporting infill and intensification through various forms of residential intensification, depending on the neighborhood and the type of designation and location. So in doing so, the place types outside of the boundary then are as farmland and rural neighborhoods, again, those hamlets, and the waste management resource recovery area, which is the long term for the W12A landfill and the surroundings. And in so doing, 80% of the rural London area is prime agricultural land, but because of the policies around infill and intensification for the urban areas, there's also recognition on the other side of that boundary that rural London's role is very important for future prosperity, economic activity, and for food security. So the permitted uses that are allowed within that area reinforce that role, and they're similar to what you see in the PPS around agriculture and agriculture-related uses. And also that urban place types are not permitted outside of the boundary. So if an application came forward for a large residential development or a large commercial plaza and it's outside of that boundary, there's no policy framework to support that. Those urban types of uses are directed inside the urban growth boundary. So what then is this comprehensive review? The Planning Act requires that official plans have to be kept up to date to conform with any new provincial plans, to have regard for provincial matters of interest. And that's a lot of orderly development, efficient use of lands. But if you look at that list in Section 2 of the Planning Act, the top two in that list are actually environmental protection and preservation of agricultural land. So it is top of mind as well, even in that list of provincial interests. And then again, consistency with the provincial policy statement as it gets updated from time to time. So an official plan has to be reviewed 10 years after it's adopted, and then every 5 years after that. So what does this mean for the City of London and the London Plan? So in December of 2016, the ministry approved the London Plan. So the review, the comprehensive review, is required by 2027. Key elements expected to be in that review are going to be consistency with provincial policy, the land that's available to accommodate future growth, again, that population projections, and then what does your land need, your vacant land, what is designated, what are they designated for, how much population could fit within that. And then in addition to that, other key considerations is protection of agriculture and the impact of a changing climate, which is the recent way the province has been phrasing climate change, is the impact of a changing climate. Now, the timing of this review, the 2021 census, that data is likely to be made available to the city by next year. However, I would also note that the London Plan, although it's 97% of policies are in effect, there are some outstanding appeals. It was appealed to, it's no longer called the OMB, but it's the new tribunal. And there are some outstanding appeals around the heights of buildings and the intensity of some uses in some neighborhoods and some of those place types. So it does leave a question to the city of how do you evaluate the ability of your land to meet needs if you don't yet know how intensive those uses may be. So those are just some considerations the city is going to have about when to start that process. And again, this is my contact information here, and happy to answer any questions. Thanks for your time. Stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Travis. That was extremely enlightening for me, I know, hopefully for many of you as well. This isn't something that we typically hear a lot about, or or we're able to find easily, this kind of information. So really appreciate you outlining that for us tonight. And I know I have a number of questions. We also have a question from the audience, and I'll bring that one up first. And then Diane and I are going to take turns maybe asking some more questions of you. But I will also remind everyone who's listening in that if you do have some thoughts to share or some questions, please just put them in the chat, and we'll bring them forward. So we did have a question asked, and I think it was addressed to Crispin, but I think there's stuff in here for both of you. It says, I'm curious about what kind of support you're seeing for the Homegrown campaign among the general public. So how about we just start with that one first with you, Crispin, and then I'll ask the rest of that question when you've had a chance to answer that.
The petitions gathered over 12,000 signatures, and that was that information came to me about a month ago. So I expect we're probably closer to a neighborhood of 15,000 or better that are supporting the Homegrown campaign.
All right, and just to clarify, that is like an online petition that everyone is welcome to read and
that's
yeah.
That's correct.
Okay. So going on with that question, it says, I'm 100% behind this initiative to preserve farmland in Ontario, and this person did also sign the petition. But I think governments at all levels are feeling pressure as a result of the current housing crisis. Preserving farmland seems to require a radical rethinking of how we build our cities, higher density, fewer suburban McMansions, but I think that would be a tough sell for many people, especially here in London. I wonder, maybe Travis, you touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but I wonder if you've got a comment there, and then Crispin will ask you to respond as well.
So as part of the comprehensive review, there is not only population forecasting, but we look at previous years of how many high density residential or medium or low or different forms of housing are being built. And then we look at what projected market trends are as well. So while not everyone would be living in that wanting to be living in that apartment building you had on your introductory slide there, the market trends are something that has to be taken into consideration, and the intention is that you designate sufficient land for these uses, and then if it is going that way, there's the opportunity within your existing boundary, you can redesignate lands. Applications do come in all the time for infill and intensification, and you know, the London plan explicitly identifies locations where this is being permitted or encouraged or directed. It's somewhat separate from, I mean, it's only separate from the expansion question in as much as if the public starts wanting more and more to live in that form and to protect the farmland, then there's less desire for the outward expansion. Because really outward expansion is driven by single family homes that they take up more land than other forms of housing. And generally there is less supply in number of years for those because of that. So when you're doing your projections out, you see that it will run out before apartment building lands will run out, right? So the discussions around affordable housing don't usually relate to single family homes. I'm also involved in some other affordable housing initiatives that the city is working on. And because of the cost of ownership even, the focus often is the rental market. And because of the way rents are going, as well as home ownership costs, the rentalship forms that you're seeing is in apartment units. But again, I think this is probably a separate forum, and we could probably talk all day about either of these topics. So I don't really want to get too far away from this either. So
I agree. Thanks. Yeah, Crispin, any thoughts?
Yes, I think first of all, the government of Ontario has stated that they're going to build transit towards the north of Barrie and going north. That's where we need to intensify that's where people should live, quite honestly. And yes, it's more inconvenient, but the land there, if we have to develop on land, let's develop on land that is less valuable and preserve the land in Southern Ontario for what it does best, which is grow food. As somebody once said, it's all valuable farmland until somebody wants it for something else. In Japan and Hong Kong, if you look at the intensification there, people don't own single family dwellings. Very, very few. It's a minority. We have the opposite reaction in Canada, and we abuse our resources, whether it's water, whether it's land, it doesn't matter. We have to get away, and no government and no level of government, whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal, will have the courage to do this. But we have to get to the mindset that we aren't all going to have single family dwellings. That is going to have to be a thing of the past. We have to choose between food, shelter, and clothing. I can live without shelter and clothing. I might be cold, but I can't live without food. And that's the saw-off that we have to make. Commodity losses are huge. I see Diane's just put a quick comment in there. You know, commodity losses, you would lose, for example, the 2,300 acres that's being proposed to be taken out of production and turned over to the city of Woodstock for development, that will lose a huge amount of food. In terms of the actual amounts, I can't give you a number, but we lose percentages of food. In fact, in Canada, only 7% of Canada's entire land base can be farmed, and that's according to the Canadian Encyclopedia. So it's not just pulling a number out of the air.
Diane, did you have a question to bring forward as well?
Jessica has another question. I think this is for Travis. I'm curious about the more political processes driving change in the UGB. You described it as though these decisions were purely numbers-based. I assume there are many other factors influencing the decisions that council makes about the UGB. How did the UGB expand by 35% in 1999, for example? Is it likely that that would occur again in the future? So I'm sorry, just two parts here.
Yeah, so it was originally introduced in 1996. The Ontario Municipal Board decision in 1999, from my understanding, was resolving appeals of the boundary that was set. Now, when London first set that boundary, there was no provincial framework around number of years that it had to be, this up to 20 or 25. So it was something that the city was trying to navigate without that kind of guidance. The OMB, of course, is a quasi-judicial tribunal, and they make their own decisions outside of the public process that goes on. So the actual establishment of the UGB, or anytime you do the review, it's part of an official plan amendment. So this is something where public notice is sent out, much like you would have heard about with Rethink London. There is public meetings and there is public feedback, and drafts of a document are brought, and there's a chance to respond from the public in public meetings. And then, of course, it can be appealed because it is a Planning Act matter. And then that decision was the result of the now called tribunal, but the other decisions would be on any given application for an expansion. I would be hard pressed to see an expansion of 35%, because even if it is done by your municipal council as a political decision, it still has to relate to the population you're expecting to see in that 20 years. And the amount of land you have already designated for apartment buildings or medium density buildings or employment lands. So we as staff, we evaluate the policies, we do the background work, and we provide recommendations to council, and try to evaluate, all of these different processes, and take into consideration the public comments we receive. And then at the end, council, as the decision-making body, decides, and then the public may or may not appeal it as well. But that 35% is, I don't foresee that happening again, unless there's a huge increase in population in the city.
So if I could ask a related question then, Travis, and that is that relationship between the municipality's decision-making capability and then the provincial plan. You mentioned the PPS, that's the provincial plan. Excuse me, provincial planning statement. Is that what it is, or the
provincial policy statement? Yeah.
Statement, yeah. And so my understanding is that, so for example, there were some changes made in legislation this past spring that impacted that. So I guess I'm wondering, can you clarify, if possible, how much influence the province has, or the government of the day would have, over a municipality's decision on their urban growth boundary?
So the minister's zoning orders is separate. That's an action of the provincial government if they so choose. It's a tool that's been around a long time. It just it hasn't been used very much until recently. Like something like Woodstock's Toyota plant. Now, I don't know if they did use an MZO, but no community of that size would, in theory, have that much industrial land just sitting there vacant and ready to go. So the intervention from the provincial government was for a particular reason. That is separate from what we normally see out of local government, and that's the standard process that our decisions and the decisions brought forward that council has to make have to align with the provincial policy statements. And then out of that, our official plan has to conform, and then our zoning regulations have to then implement those policies. So it's kind of like those Russian nesting dolls, the Matryoshka dolls, right? So we at the city are the smallest doll in the bottom, but the decisions of council are supposed to fit within that framework. The MZO stuff is outside of that.
Can I just speak to that a bit, if you don't mind, Lila?
Yeah.
MZOs, it doesn't matter if you have what doll you are in the Russian pile. If a municipality goes to the government and goes to the Minister of Municipal Affairs and says, our council, whether it's London, whether it's Tavistock, whether it's Thames Centre, it doesn't matter. If they go and they say, I want this land and I'm asking you for an MZO, the minister has said, I will grant that. It is driven by the municipality. And if the municipality asks for it, as I say, whether it's London, and to London's credit, they have a robust planning system and they have lots of land at present. So hopefully this won't be an issue with London, but it is outside of London. It is in Perth County, for example. And it may well happen with Woodstock, depending on what happens with the 2,300 acres they want. It's the minister's ability to do it without any question and without anybody having any opportunity to appeal it or say anything about it. And it's driven by the council. So that it's a very dangerous tool. And Travis is absolutely right. It has not been used, very, very little, until this government, unfortunately.
Maybe you both could comment on the green belt, expanding the green belt that's around Toronto. It's being eaten away, but it has been effective at retaining some agricultural land in that area. Would it be useful to expand that to all of Ontario, perhaps? Both Travis and Crispin, please.
Would you like to go first, Crispin?
Actually, I'm kind of fascinated to hear what your answer would be, but sure, I don't mind, Travis, yes. The OFA, we've talked about this around the board table, and one of the things we've suggested is the entire province should be green belted. And the reason we say that is because the green belt is designed to protect farmland, to produce food. Without that, you get nothing. The green belt isn't parkland, and that unfortunately is sometimes what happens around the GTA area. People will go out to the green belt thinking, oh, it's wonderful. I can ride my ATV out there and do whatever I want. It's farmland, it's people's property. So ideally, if we could say the entire province is green belted, certainly that would be positive, because then you have to do the agricultural impact assessments. Then before land is taken out of production and turned into development, there would be an assessment done instead of not necessarily having to happen.
Yeah, they are an interesting tool, and they are used all over the world to various degrees of success. It would be interesting to see if the rest of the province were to have them, if they would be treated in the same way, I guess. Because in part the issue with the GTA one is the concentration of population surrounding it. The theory is that they're supposed to work kind of like urban growth boundaries in that it manages your outward expansion. But then on the other hand, if you're looking to kind of environmental impacts, something you see on the other side is those then still commuting, but this commuter shed you have now goes beyond it and then further again. So for protection of agriculture, it's very helpful. For the days of when people had to drive to offices, there were other impacts. So yeah, it would be interesting for sure.
We have a question from Bakar for Chris, and interesting question. Thanks for raising it, Bakar. He asks, do we have any representation of farmers in municipal government?
I don't know. Travis could probably answer for the City of London. I don't know that there are in London. One of the problems with municipal government, and it's a fantastic question. I was on municipal council for 19 years. And the council was predominantly farmers. But what's happening now is that more and more councils, and I look at our own in Thames Centre, have less farmers and more people who live in the urban centres. And what that does is they put pressure they look at their job from an urban lens, understandably. I'm not being critical of them, that's their constituency. But they live in a rural area. And so what's happening with municipal government throughout the province is an erosion of farmers on council. They either don't run or can't get elected or are quite simply outnumbered. And when that happens, the policies change to meet the urban center as opposed to having policies when I was on council that met the rural nature of the municipality.
To my knowledge, there isn't right now. I could be mistaken. There's also the matter of the ward boundaries and how they're drawn, because they're done by population. So even though the city is 60-40 urban rural, the way they're drawn, none of them are entirely rural in representation. There is separately, along with other citizens advisory committees, there is an agricultural advisory committee that reports to council, but the actual members of council, I don't believe there are any, but I would have to look that up.
One of the things about this particular forum that I think is absolutely wonderful is that it's an opportunity for people to learn a bit about the rural challenges that we face, and in turn understand London's plan even better, because Travis explained things extremely well. So one of the things we have to do as farmers is we go to councils and we try to educate the councillors on what our job is as farmers, as agricultural people, what the impact of the agri-food network is on their municipality. So our job becomes not just making food for people to eat, but it becomes one of educating people so they understand what we do and how the food gets to their table.
If I could follow up on that, Travis, one of the questions I was going to ask is just based on your experience you've had, you know, in London and throughout your career. Is there an understanding, do you think, when it comes to urban planning? I mean, it sounds strange to say, is there an understanding of like rural and agricultural significance when it comes to urban planning, because they seem to be different things. But do you think there is that understanding when it comes to planning, when it comes to municipal decisions, and when it comes to just basic, you know, awareness of people who live in an urban dwelling? Is there an understanding of that fact that we do rely on food that is grown close to us to sustain us? Or does it seem like they're in different silos, so to speak, no pun intended?
That would be hard to generalize. I mean, many of us might have eaten dinner before this started, and whether or not we thought about what we were eating and where it came from is kind of up to us as individuals. Urban planning as a profession isn't just urban. There are programs that are focused on rural planning at the universities. If you are in policy planning, such as I am, a lot of it addresses growth management and that relationship between urban and rural areas. There's a lot of the provincial documents, again, it's that balance of meeting those competing interests. So, you know, within the profession, there's many who know and many who specialize in rural issues as well. So But what you hear about in the news is usually more urban focused. But I'd like to think there's some understanding, certainly, and these sorts of forums help with that as well, get the word out.
If I may, just to touch on to what Travis said, I was on a meeting today with the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, and they had some statistics. They were talking about 48% of the population of Canada, based on a survey done by Grassroots Public Affairs, know a little about farming. 70% of the people they talk to have never visited an operational farm. So that's why we have an educational aspect and a lot of work to do to get people to understand what we do. So, when only 30% have visited a farm, that's a pretty small number.
Maybe, Crispin, you could just touch on what's the problem with just moving it further north? If it's not available in Southern Ontario, just move it further north. What's the problem with that?
Climate would be one, but and actually I say that jokingly, but that's actually quite serious. We have a climate that grows things like sugar beets, onions. You look at the Holland Marsh, you look at the Niagara area, you can't grow peaches in Northern Ontario. So moving farms to the north is good if you're into beef cattle, if you're doing dairy, for example, some of the livestock production, because they can grow hay quite readily. They can grow some grain crops to use for feed, but they aren't going to grow the food that we eat that you get around here. Let's face it, if you try and grow tomatoes in Northern Ontario, you might get them, you might not, but you're certainly not going to grow 50 or 100 acres of tomatoes or more the way they do in Leamington. Plus the soil type itself. We have 7 classes of soil in Ontario. 1, 2, and 3 are the best. 4 is good, 5 is marginal, 6 is Northern Ontario, and 7 is basically unfarmable. So much of the land, when you start to go north of Barrie, for example, you get into pockets of class 3 or maybe class 4, but a lot of it is 4 and 5 land. It just isn't productive. It's rocky, it's difficult to work with. So climate, geography, it just makes it that much more difficult.
So if we're coming close to the time of wrapping this up, I thank you very much for the responses that you're providing. If I could ask one more question, maybe, and then we'll close it off. So if any of you are holding back on burning questions that you have in your mind, make sure to get them in the chat so we can get them asked before the end of the session. Travis, when you were talking about the review, the comprehensive review that'll happen in 2027, or that's due in 2027, and you mentioned the key elements that it will focus on, the population growth, protection of agricultural land was one of them. And I wondered, does that take into account, I guess, the local food security sort of lens for the population that's living within that area? So is there a tie between let's say the percentage of agricultural farmland that would be set aside? Is that based on the population of London, or what's the connection there?
I don't think it's that explicit as sort of something quantified like that. But when the evaluation gets done, you have to look, if you find that there are too many people relative to the size of the boundary, the option, you have to look at alternative directions for growth. So you can designate more land for high density. Now, that assumes there's enough of the public that wants to live in that kind of form of housing. But if you do have to expand the boundary, then, like Crispin was saying about the different prime agriculture and the different classes of soils, you do have to weigh the impact on your environment or on your lands. So is there a direction you could grow that might have less impact than going in a different direction? It's up to council to weigh those decisions, but we as staff try and come up with criteria to evaluate, because you also then have the public who will be asking, for their lands to be considered to be added because they want to have them developed or they want them included. So evaluation criteria related to the natural hazard lands and flooding and the environmental lands and the soil classification, and those are the, if you get to the test of your population is outgrowing the boundary you seem to have, you then have to figure out, well, how do we as a community address this? And then that's what the official plan amendment process is. That's what the public meetings would be at that point. That would be the conversation that the community would be having.
Great, thank you.
I should also note that food security and the food system is actually a chapter within the London plan. And that's pretty uncommon for official plans, which are usually just around, what's the height of your building and those sorts of land use designations, to actually have a food systems chapter.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Travis, because it is a very forward-thinking plan, absolutely. And for those of you here tonight who maybe aren't familiar with it or haven't heard of the London plan or any of the or looking for more information, I guess, on the planning process, I'd encourage you to go to the City of London website, the Get Involved page, and there's all kinds of information there about how you can get involved and how you can participate in a lot of these processes. So it's very informative and really helpful. Before I pass it over to Diane to do the closing, I just wanted to voice Mike's comment that he shared in the chat, which is that it seems among small rural towns, there's a dichotomy in that they want better transit links to larger centers and better infrastructure, but that at the same time will enhance the urbanization of those rural towns. So thanks, Mike, for that comment. Lots to think about tonight. Diane, I'll pass it over to you to do the closing.
Well, thank you all very much for attending. I think it's great. We had such a good turnout. Thank you to Crispin for your presentation. Really gives good thought. Anyone attending here who hasn't had a look at the Ontario Federation of Agriculture's webpage, please go and have a look. They have a lot of interesting papers on discussions that are going on that are relevant to any of our lives, really. They have a great program for youth to learn to cook local foods called 6x16, and they have other information there as well. Travis, thank you so much for being part of this. And Travis provided his information, and it would be important to keep in touch with him as well, with your concerns and things that you want to have the city be aware of. I really thank Deepika and Leah too, and of the London Environmental Network. They have been invaluable. Those people, you both have been great, especially Deepika, to get us on track and get us here tonight. Thanks to Lella for her contribution always. And the London Food Policy Council has great information on their website too. We have another event coming up August the 4th from 7 till 8:15 again, Growing Food in the City. And we will have Chuck Parker, a senior planner for the City of London, who will be presenting at that time. I thank you all very much for being here tonight, and any questions, forward them and we'll hopefully get them answered for you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Diane. And just to a previous question that was in the chat, yes, this is being recorded. You'll also all receive a follow-up email with the links that were mentioned tonight and with a link to the recording of this event. So, and there'll be a chance there for you to follow up if you've got any further comments. And stay tuned for the city's process for their next comprehensive review. That's not underway yet, but if you're interested in that, keep tuned to that City of London page, and you'll hear more about that as it develops. Thanks very much for attending, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you.